The numbers are staggering. Between 1980 to 2009, Africa lost anywhere from $1.2 trillion and $1.4 trillion. Fast forward to 2020. According to the Economic Development in Africa Report 2020 by the UN Conference on Trade and Development, Africa loses about $88.6 billion. That is 3.7% of the continent's gross domestic product annually in illicit financial flows, IFFs. This is enough to finance almost half the annual financing gap of $200 billion that the continent faces to achieve the SDGs. African countries with high IFFs spend an average 25% less on health and 58% less on education. These lost substantial resources divert resources from social development and raise serious problems for financing development in Africa. These risks have been recognized in the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, specifically in Target 16.4 of the Sustainable Development Goals. The Addis Ababa Action Agenda on Financing for Development also calls for redoubling efforts to substantially reduce IFFs by 2030. The Action Agenda invites the appropriate international institutions and regional organizations to publish estimates of the volume and composition of illicit financial flows. However, there is no globally accepted methodology to monitor IFFs. The lack of reliable, objective evidence can hinder policy interventions and undermine possibilities to tackle the problem. And the numbers tell only part of the story. It is a story that exposes how highly complex and deeply entrenched practices have flourished over the past decades with devastating impact, but barely made it into the major news headlines. A joint report from the African Development Bank and the Global Financial Integrity says that the illicit hemorrhage of resources from Africa is about 4 times Africa's current external debt. It must be stated and emphasized that illicit financial flows out of Africa far surpass the amount of money received from outside. Today, we're looking at tracking illicit financial flows from Africa. I'm Tolulokwe Adelaru Balogun. Welcome. This is Business Edge. Now joining me is the Chief Economist, Streetonomics, Gospel Obele, as we take a look at this particular situation. Gospel, welcome back to Business Edge. Thank you again for joining me.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. So looking at this, there are several sources of illicit financial flows, and most often the research typically doesn't capture drug trafficking and smuggling. The more typically researched financial flow ways is what I want us to start off with first. So take us through some of the ways that money is illegally leaving the continent.
All right, so there are different perspectives to it. I mean, like you had mentioned earlier, and to a very large extent, they exist because we have consciously or unconsciously, through our actions and inactions, created leakages in the system through which these things can thrive. So a very large extent as well, you also have situations where policies that have been implemented in the financial services space were not critically thought through. All right, so what happens is that these policies leave room for more leakages, or they act as incentives for more leakages, to allow for illicit financial flows. So some of the pathways through which this thing happen is some form of organized business. All right, so on the front line, it may look like an organized business outfit, but on the backside, it's just a platform to exchange, or a platform for exchange and to engage illicit financial inflows of some sort. That's one. Secondly, you have outright avenues through which the government does not approve or does not go according to the moral stance of the economy or value of the value system in a sense. So you have drug trafficking, human trafficking, and all of those abuses can also be used as an avenue for illicit financial inflows. You also have a situation where cryptocurrencies, or to a large extent, and some commodity assets have been abused, all right, as a form of capital flight, all right, through illicit financial inflows. So those are 3 basic lines if you want to think about it. Then you also have core formal business routes, all right, through which, last week we talked about capital flows and all of that in the African economy. Some of these capital flows have some form of illicit financial flows, all right, underscored within the process and all that. So you have under invoicing, over invoices, all right, latching on subsidy payments and other some form of trade policies that government have introduced. But on the flip side, people have latched on those policies as a medium to exchange value of currencies across the line. So there are different pockets and technicalities to the illicit financial flows conversation, which makes it way complex and difficult to deal, quite honestly, and to take a whole lot of coordinated efforts, not just from the monetary policy end now, but from security experts, from forensic experts, and all of that, to track them down to a large extent.
All right, so what we've seen with some of the research as well is that the illicit financial flows also favor political changes that often go hand in hand with the weakening of state institutions, like those who are meant to monitor and enforce the tax and regulations around these things, and also growing corruption and rent sinking. For African economies, what has been the impact of the IFFs, of the illicit financial flows out of the continent?
Very huge, very huge. I mean, recently we discussed the Pandora Papers, challenge, a case where a lot of previous ministers and previous government officials had offshore accounts, all right, through which they used to wire monies to other developed economies and all that, buy assets and lock them down. In fact, you also have a case where people have engaged so much in illicit financial flow, IFSs, to an extent where they can now even plug those things into core properties, all right, both home and abroad. You know, so what some persons frontline as a major industry transformational business to a large extent underneath some of these things we're discussing. You also see a situation where, for instance, state budgets, you see a case of copy and paste in a sense, all right? Budgets are not positioned to be transformational in nature. And that's because the copy and paste nature allows for us to retain leakages within the system and pass a lot of amounts of money through corrupt means, corrupt officials into offshore accounts and all that. So it's a value chain. All right, illicit financial flows are a value chain in somewhat. And in terms of impact, all right, I mean, Dambisa Moyo in her book talked about Africa does not need some form of aid assistance from anybody. You know, Africa can be self-reliant because we have what it takes. And those are part of what she was talking about. You know, in some cases, some of these monies are lent back to us by foreign institutions are from some form of capital flows that have gone through some redocumentation process, all right, and then sent back to you as a loan or debt and all of that. So there are intricacies, and also in international space, you have some incentives that have enabled for capital flows in the African market. So it has robbed us to a large extent of developmental financing measures, and to a large extent, it also fits into the extractive institutions financing instrument to keep the nation and its people at a level of poverty for a longer time.
So our own money that is leaving the continent can oftentimes be returned as a loan that we must then pay for. So as you said, it's quite an intricate, complex conversation, and there's also the complicity of Western countries and Western financial organizations, which we'll get into. But in December of 2020, the AU launched an $8.4 million multi-donor action with the European Union and the German Federal Ministry of Economic Development and Cooperation to combat the scourge of IFFs. And we've seen talks, we've seen conferences, we've seen papers, we've seen so much happen in the past 10, 20, 30 years. But would you say there's been any progress, particularly in addressing IFFs as it relates to the African continent?
I don't think so, because one of the major reasons why I don't think so is that there's a rising surge of young people getting into these illicit capital flows markets, all right? There's a rising surge by the day, all right? Internet, cybersecurity risk are rising by the day and all of these things. So what we've seen is, yes, conferences are good, talk conversations are good, A-list institutions are coming to the fore to discuss them, but the action and the actors who are involved in the process, to a large extent, if you look at it from that angle, there are no political or institutional will to engage, all right? It's a lot difficult at that level because you'll be tapping on the interest. A lot of us are also involved who are powering this process to continue to a large extent. And until the talks move into action, right, position to engage those critical segments of people, we're not getting anywhere. We'll only be repeating yearly conferences.
So very quickly before we go on a break, in terms of the people involved, the monitoring and the tracking as well, there's no globally recognized methodology for tracking or monitoring IFFs as it is. How much of a hindrance do you think that is? And then how are they monitoring and tracking the estimated numbers that we see coming out right now?
So I don't want to say that there are no global methodologies to tracking. I would rather say they've not been made public. Okay. Or they are not made known to some certain markets or some certain agencies yet. So to speak, for instance, take the United States, very complex security architecture right there, and they can literally track anything in the sense, all right? They can develop new technologies to track anything. In fact, the newer technologies used to track anything that track things that we don't even know about in a sense. So at that level of intelligence, it's just normal. When you're dealing in an intelligence committee, there's an access of information, there's a level of information you can access as an individual or as a stakeholder. So it's given. Those methodologies exist, but they are not made public at a level. All right, that's one. So secondly, these institutions over time, all right, can leverage the arsenal of intelligence that they have to pick any individual. We've seen the cases of hush puppies and the likes, all right, who have been picked out. All right, and some Nigerians who have engaged in that over time. So it's a function of, number one, they are not made public. Secondly, for Africa, we need to probably find a way to build our intelligence to that level. But because to a large extent, Africans we have a culture around greed, not as though it's not a culture in the Western space, all right, but we've not also developed legal and strong institutions to counter that, such that you still have a situation where there is shared prosperity, social inclusion, and then you're still having to grow into mature things. But right now, even those in power would not even approve of such methodologies to be implemented in this context, even if they're given for free from the FBI and co.
Okay, so Gospel, we're going to go on a break, but when we come back, we'll talk a bit about the parties involved, complicity involved in all of this. Is there cooperation between African states in order to address this? Because sometimes this money leaves one African country and travels through a few others before it actually makes it out of the continent. And of course, why is it such an important task for Africa to address the issue of the illicit financial flows? The conversation will continue right after this. So with me is the Chief Economist, Streetonomics, Gospel Obele, and we're talking about addressing Africa's illicit financial flows conversation. And as we get back into that, the UNCTAD and the UNODC finalized a conceptual framework for the statistical measurement of IFFs in late 2020. Now, the framework comes from expert consultations and considerations of an international task force involving international organizations and national tax, customs, and statistics experts. Pilot projects using the new framework kicked off in Afghanistan, Colombia, Ecuador, Mexico, Nigeria, Panama, and Peru, and more are planned for this year. Now, these pilot projects are also showing that the problem is bigger than estimated. So, Gospel, I'll ask you, do you think we really understand and really know the scope of what's of the amount of IFFs rather that are leaving the continent?
Well, I'll say yes and no at the same time. Yes and no because let me start from yes. Yes, because this was part of the insights that formed the central bank banning cryptocurrency in February. All right, there was an intelligence release from the United States that during the pandemic and into late 2020, Nigeria came up on the radar as the most, all right, the country with the highest illicit capital flows on the cryptocurrency market, doing almost $200 million a week, thereabout. You know, so central bank has that information, and at that level, it also poses as a national security risk. All right, but when an item is a national security risk, you don't expect them to discuss it publicly. There will be conversations around how do we navigate such. But in terms of managing that, and as well as managing how this technological tool can be used to improve the economy, we've seen a situation where the central bank has taken quite some very, very harsh moves that ended up hurting the economy. So on that yes bit, they know at a very high level, they have a lot of intelligence to work with. On the no bit is the fact that people are devising newer means, all right, to outsmart or to maximize or make most of the leakages we currently have in the Nigerian economy and in other parts of the African economy. And in some cases, because we do not have data, because we do not embrace use of technology, all right, because government institutions, even monetary institutions, are largely also very traditional in their approach. They underestimate, all right, the level of effort that goes into illicit capital inflows in the sense. So it's a mix of both narratives. And if you look at it from that angle as well, we can rightly say that the central bank of Nigeria, to a large extent, even still underestimates, all right, how much of money goes beyond the shores into offshore accounts and into all sorts of so-called formal businesses, to just flaunt wealth and the likes. All right. Okay. So I think there is a gross underestimation of the efforts in that space.
All right. So you had mentioned the Pandora Papers earlier, and we've seen that, again, it has brought up conversations around the wealthy, how much taxes they're paying, how they're moving their money. So safe havens are also implicated in this conversation about IFFs. But we also have legal established entities that have been shown to be involved in this. Many hear the West talking about stopping it, but see the West as complicit in this. So, Gospel, is the West really vested in stopping IFFs from Africa, and what more should they be doing?
On one end, I'll say yes. On the other end, I'll say no, because yes, because they have the information, they know about it. At the point where when it presents a form of national security risk to them, they would act, just like we've seen recently in the case of hush puppy and the likes. I would say no also because sometimes it can also be a strategic tool, right, for control. So it can go either ways. And sometimes there are gray areas around foreign relations, foreign diplomacy and all of that. All right. So there's really no right answer or wrong answer in this sense. However, what I can say confidently is the fact that there is need to curtail. All right, even legal outfits also engage in such. Then again, you want to look at it from a context and say that, okay, government has not done enough in terms of accountability, transparency, and being responsible. All right, and that affects compliance, all right, and a level of commitment from legal entities to engage and do things right. So sometimes what we even term as illicit capital inflows can be some form of looking for an intelligent escape avenue as a corporate entity to evade or avoid taxes in a sense. Although that's not to say that it's worth, that's not to endorse it, but it's also to say that government also have to step up in transparency and, all right, in its public leadership in a sense. All right, until we can do that, we may not be able to even curtail or block, identify, curtail or block some of the leakages that have been identified to a large extent.
So let's talk about us as African nations and cooperation. A lot of cooperative issues have struggled between African countries. And while a lot of this money will go to the West, a lot of it actually leaves one African country first, lands in another one or two before it actually heads outside of the continent. Are we cooperating enough? Is there enough conversation, cooperation, collaboration between African nations to reduce this scourge that affects all of us?
I don't really think we are cooperating enough, and it's not just an issue of illicit financial flows. Even across the AFCFTA and other major regional competitiveness issues, we are not even cooperating enough. So that already gives huge leakages. All right, that lack of cooperation is an incentive for so many leakages, and for people to seek to game the system. So and the way illicit capital flows work, all right, it moves from the hardest to the most weakest country as a trade journey route to get the monies out, in a sense. So that's why you see that 1 or 2, 3 more African countries can be involved in one transaction. And as the money moves from one pocket to the other, there's an incentive to keep that movement going, right? So I agree with you that there has to be a lot of cooperation, all right? And cooperation sometimes can also be a function of the strength of institutions that exist across different markets. So even if we seek to cooperate by word of mouth or by signing just like the SCFTA was signed, it could also be that country A can be stronger in terms of monetary practice and development than country B. So then again, cooperation is being undermined because of the lack of institutional effectiveness across countries. So cooperation is not just at the level of documentation, it's now at the level of doing the right work and owning up per country block or per region block, all right, to fix the necessary infrastructure, all right, aligned across these countries to ensure that before you move from country A to country B, you have been identified and the right measures have been taken. So there's need for consistency across institutional capacity and effectiveness to block or to track illicit financial inflows. And data is very, very important in this mix. So for a continent that doesn't even have, that doesn't take data seriously or has a poor data culture, then this conversation would keep happening for ages to come.
So Gospel, before you leave, I'll ask you a question. 1 minute. Why is curbing illicit financial flows so important for Africa?
Yes, it's very important because it just tells you the potential of money that could have been invested in Africa, all right? And if you look at all these developed countries, they found a way. I mean, I just said in one of the answers that nothing is white and black anymore, all right? Things have gotten more complex. Even what we define as right or legal process of doing things have one leakages and make them illegal, all right? So we need to tighten these loopholes and sometimes redivert these finances into proper use of things in terms of developmental growth causes and human capital. And that's what nations outside Nigeria or outside Africa have done properly well. All right, so we need to be able to redefine these things and rechannel these things and create an enabling environment, all right, to accommodate for a redefinition, a reuse and recycle of these finances. Until we can do that at a particular level, then until we can do that at a particular level, we would only be susceptible or open to what we term as foreign aid or some form of official development assistance, which in some cases can be these monies coming back to us and we are servicing those monies back again to them. So we're deploying these monies right into key developmental causes, because even if they come back to us, all right, do we have the discipline and the right infrastructure to ensure that these monies are properly invested internally? That's the next big question we would ask ourselves.
All right, Gospel Bailey, thank you as always. Glad to have you on the show. I'll be seeing you again soon.
Thank you for having me as well. Thank you.
All right, thank you. And a conversation that needs to be had. Now, UN Under Secretary General and Special Advisor on Africa, Christina Duarte, said the estimated $88.6 billion that Africa loses annually is not just a number. It should be looked at through the lens of missed development opportunities, lost livelihoods, and increased poverty. This means seeing it in the context of the millions of people, Africans, that could have been lifted out of poverty, the enormous number of job opportunities that could have been created for Africa's burgeoning youth population, the thousands of hospitals and schools that could have been built, and how all these could have translated into strengthening stability and cohesion for societies and communities on the continent. There is much work to be done. You're watching Business Edge. NC42 Watch is up next. NC42 Watch is where we wrap things up today, and we start in South Africa, where the current strike by South African steel industry workers has cost the industry about 500 million rand in lost output. The CEO of the Steel and Engineering Industries Federation of Southern Africa, Lucio Trentini, said the work stoppage has also resulted in the loss of about 100 million rand in wages. An upside risk for inflation in the coming months will likely lead South Africa's Reserve Bank to hike rates by 75 basis points to 4.25% next year in order to keep consumer prices in check in the long run. The survey of economists taken recently showed the South African Reserve Bank would hike rates by 25 basis points in the first, second, and fourth quarters. Africa-focused private equity firm Adenia Partners has acquired a majority stake in Altiland SA, the parent company of Redland Roses, a grower of premium fresh-cut roses in Kenya, for an undisclosed amount. The investment will also lead to the growth in the number of employees, which are a significant number of women, from 500 today to nearly 750 in 2 years. And finally, the Nigerian Communications Commission has said that the 5G technology deployment in Nigeria is 97% ready. Last month, the government approved the national policy on fifth-generation networks for Nigeria's digital economy. This effectively gave the go-ahead for auction and deployment of the network in Africa's largest economy. And it's a wrap for this week. Thank you for joining us as we went through a number of stories concerning the biggest financial, business, and economic stories coming out of the continent. Don't forget that we do this Monday through Friday, 11 a.m. West African time, right here on News Central, because Africa is first to us. I'm Tolu Lokwe. Adelari Balogun. Have a pleasant weekend.